All right, so our final snippet for this week is going to look at the late 19th century, which is a period of American expansion, but as part of a broader period of expansion of imperialism in the world. This is the time in which Africa is carved up into various colonies. Also, China is carved up into either colonies or these things called spheres of influence, where foreign countries were essentially, I mean, China nominally remained independent, but the foreign countries essentially dominated huge swaths of Chinese territory. The U.S. Initially doesn't super participate in this imperialistic surge. It relies more on informal empire, spreading U.S. economic power through trade, spreading U.S. cultural influence through Protestant missionaries. This is a photograph of Protestant missionaries in China. They're very active in the late 19th century. But there is some formal U.S. Imperialism. The best example probably is the acquisition of Alaska, which is obtained by the U.S. after the Civil War, largely through the initiative of William Seward, who was the Secretary of State. Alaska at this point was under the control of Russia. No one thought Alaska would eventually be a state. So Alaska is the first foreign acquisition by the U.S. that was not seen as even a possible state. But Seward sees it, not incorrectly, as critical to controlling the strategic environment in the North Pacific, and he wants to expand U.S. access to the region. This emphasis on the need for the U.S. to abandon its anti-imperialist ideals and embrace imperialism accelerates in the 1880s, when the U.S. Suddenly starts, for the first time really in American history, starts running a fairly significant trade deficit. And so a lot of these kind of fresh imperialist thinkers make the argument, look, the way we're going to get around, ensure American prosperity, is to acquire colonies. Colonies will have to trade with the United States. So this idea is being very much pushed in the 1880s. And there's also this sense, and this is the best example. It's a pamphlet tract by an evangelical Christian named Josiah Strong, that makes the case that the U.S. has a moral obligation to engage in imperialism, to teach foreign governments to be more moral. This is kind of classic cultural and sort of racial imperialism. The clearest example of this pattern winds up being events in Hawaii, which Hawaii is this really interesting, it's a country, it's an independent country in the 19th century. It's kind of buffer state between Britain, France, and the United States in the middle of the Pacific. In 1893, there's a coup in Hawaii, which is sponsored by American commercial interests, especially the Dole Pineapple Company, with the covert, and in some cases not particularly covert, support of the American Navy, which succeeds in overthrowing the monarch of Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani. And the new government immediately petitions for annexation. The problem is, by this point, there's a new president of the U.S., a guy named Grover Cleveland, who's a Democrat who's opposed to annexation. And so Hawaii, for 4 years, it remains independent. They don't reverse the coup. The government's kind of a U.S. collaborationist government, and in 1898, the U.S. will annex Hawaii. Similarly, the U.S. is quite active in this border dispute between Venezuela, here on the left, and a British colony called British Guyana, modern day Guyana. And the core thing here is that the British claim a very substantial expansion of colonial soil, both the green and the blue areas on this map, after gold is discovered in parts of the Orinoco River. So Britain is basically trying to seize Venezuelan territory. Venezuelans appeal to the United States. The U.S. Issues a statement which comes to be known as the Olney Doctrine, OLNEY, named for the Secretary of State in the Cleveland administration, saying the U.S. will not tolerate such action. And the idea is to give the Monroe Doctrine some teeth. So there's a lot of discussion about imperialism and expansion. It's very much in the air, and it's a major issue in the election of 1896 and, frankly, the subsequent election in 1900. The Democrats nominated a pretty left-wing candidate, at least in except for social issues, named William Jennings Bryan, who was a populist congressman from Nebraska. The Republicans countered with also a very strong candidate, William McKinley, from Ohio. Bryan is a brilliant oratory, campaigns very, very aggressively. He's the best the Democrats probably could have offered, but the best is not enough. McKinley, who runs on a pro-expansion imperialist platform, prevails. So McKinley's president, brings in lots of imperialists into his administration, especially the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a guy named Theodore Roosevelt, who of course we'll encounter again. Roosevelt and imperialist figures within the McKinley administration, also I think to a certain extent McKinley himself, is very concerned with the situation in China. So here's the map of China, where of China and Southeast Asia, where more and more territories is formally being claimed as colonies. They're moving beyond this sphere of influence approach. And Roosevelt is telling McKinley, look, this is going to be critical for the U.S. In the future. We need to get access to this market. So there's this push for the U.S. to play the imperialist role in Asia. And there's also a colonial rebellion that's going on in Cuba, which remained a Spanish colony until the end of the 19th century. The U.S. sends an observer vessel to this called the Maine, and the Maine explodes. The McKinley government blames it on the Spanish. There's overwhelming evidence that it was not the Spanish that blew it up. It looks like it was just an accident. But there's a call for war against Spain, both to redeem the Maine and to strike back, Americans say, against what they see as Spanish colonial excesses. William McKinley, their stern-looking individual who was president at the point, is basically sympathetic to this imperialist cause. And in 1898, the U.S. declares war against Spain and targets Spanish entities around the world, not just Cuba, but also Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, and in East Asia, the Spanish Philippines. And the U.S. quickly defeats the Spanish. They drive the Spanish out of Cuba, they drive the Spanish out of Puerto Rico, and they drive the Spanish out of the Philippines. The U.S. had promised Cuba its independence before the war began, and so the U.S. can't now just sort of seize it as a colony. But in both Puerto Rico and the Philippines, the U.S. does seize them as colonies. And the effort, especially to move in the Philippines, is a policy victory for Theodore Roosevelt, who's pushing McKinley to be more aggressive on these matters. The only problem, there is an independence movement that is going on in the Philippines at the time the U.S. Comes in, headed by this man, Emilio Aguinaldo, and who understandably does not want his country to become a U.S. colony. And so Aguinaldo turns from fighting the Spanish to fighting the Americans who are trying to occupy the country. And the result is a 3-year guerrilla war. It's a brutal conflict in which Aguinaldo's forces function as guerrillas. So they'll fight Americans and they'll kind of blend into the countryside. And the Americans respond to this with a policy known as the water cure, what we know now as waterboarding. The goal is to simulate drowning as a way of forcing people to confess. It's now a war crime to do this. These pictures are censored at the time, so they don't get back to the U.S. Public. But it's a reminder of how this pursuit of imperialism, and here's the map of U.S. Colonies, or in Cuba's case, kind of de facto control as of the late 19th century. So it's Puerto Rico, Alaska, Hawaii, Samoa, and also the Philippines. The U.S. has become a major imperial player. And the question as we move into the 20th century, which will be our next group of snippets next week, is how is this all going to play out for Americans moving forward? So that's it for our 3 snippets for this week.